Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. It is good to have you with us. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and what a gift that you would spend some of your time here today. And we have been walking through a book that for a lot of us has been just a significant part of our journey. Some of us are reading it together. Some are just kind of like listening along. In whatever way you are doing that, we are engaging in this book by a guy named Dallas Willard called The Divine Conspiracy. And today, as we get into chapter 5, I'm really excited for who we get to unpack it with. And a good friend of mine, El Hidalgo, is with us. Michael Hidalgo is coming to us from Denver, Colorado. And Michael's been on the podcast before. And if you don't know him, he's a lead pastor of a church in the Denver area called Denver Community Church. Just a phenomenal and really important church, and they are doing wonderful, great things there. He's written a few books. He's a speaker, retreat leader, and does coaching. Would you call it leadership coaching, what you're doing? Or how are you defining executive coaching?
Yeah, coaching with teams and leaders.
Coaching with teams and leaders, yeah. So is doing that kind of work in partnership with an organization called Giant. And so also, like, I experience you, Michael, as this really like thoughtful and wise and like grounded guide that I find that whenever we're having conversations or we're in groups, we're having conversations, like this non-anxious presence in the way that you are processing and thinking about things. And I've always just really appreciated that. So it's really good to get to have your voice here on the podcast. Thanks for being here, man.
Oh, thanks. Those are kind words. And yeah, man, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the chapter, I would be curious to hear about your Dallas Willard origin story. Like, how did you first come across Dallas? How did you first end up reading The Divine Conspiracy? How did all of that, what did that look like for you?
Yeah, well, when I went to a Christian university and wasn't really compelled by, I would say, the Christian faith when I came out of that college experience. And my parents introduced me to a pastor at their church, and we started hanging out a lot. He was the first one actually who affirmed all the questions I was asking instead of warning me about asking questions. And so he invited me into his world a lot, and I don't think he knew what he was doing because I think I was a pestering presence, not a non-anxious presence at that point. And when I was 22 years old, I was with him in his office, and I was asking him a million questions. He was clearly trying to get something done, but I didn't care. And I still don't know to this day. I've never gone back and asked him if he handed me the book to get me to be quiet for a bit or if he really wanted me just to read it. And he held it up and said, "Have you read this book?" And I said, "No." He said, "Start reading it." And he handed it to me across his desk. And I sat in a chair in the corner of his office. And midway through the first chapter, there was something in me where I was like, this could make sense of the Christian faith. This, and not in a way of explaining everything I had experienced, but a complete reorientation. It's that flying upside down piece that he talks about. And I think I read the first 3 chapters just sitting in that chair. I was enraptured in it. And then I got up and drove to Barnes & Noble on my way home and bought it. And as I was showing you before we hit record, I have 3 different highlighter colors in it and 2 different ink colors in it from all the times that I've gone through it and read it over the years.
One of the things that impresses me in that story is, as I've asked this question to other people, like, a lot of us, me included, are like, oh gosh, it was so hard the first time I read it. It took me so long to get through it. And you're like, yeah, I just sat in his office in the corner and I read the first 3 chapters. That's just stupid. That's stupid to me. Well, today we are getting into chapter 5, which Willard calls The Rightness of the Kingdom Heart Beyond the Goodness of Scribes and Pharisees. And I got to give you props because this is by far the longest chapter. I think significantly the longest chapter.
Significantly. Yeah. I don't know if you I didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or be upset
Yeah.
that this was the chapter I was assigned.
No, it's because I trust you and love you, and because you read the first 3 chapters while you're sitting in the corner of the office. So, like, you know, I wasn't going to give that to our friends Jason Miller or Justin Morgan or somebody like that. I can't trust those guys with that. Um, and then I just want to remind folks that are listening, because especially if you're reading along, because this is such a long chapter, um, our goal is like, we're not trying to dissect everything in this. There's plenty of like, there's a lot in this chapter. He gets into the weeds on a few things in some of the text and stuff, and so we can certainly go into those places wherever you want to go into those places. But this isn't necessarily meant to be like, we're not trying to do a play by play of the entire chapter. We are not trying to make sure that we cover everything. It's more about like how we experienced it, what it did to us, what it does in us. So I just kind of want to remind folks that are listening along, because this feels like a good chapter to remind us about like kind of what we're doing here. But I thought we would start with, towards the beginning of the chapter, one of the things that he writes that I found like actually really helpful was, he says, he's quoting what Jesus says, that we're to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. But the way that he words it and phrases it and kind of maybe translates it or adds to it is, he says, we are to be perfect or whole as our Father, the ones in heaven, is perfect or whole. And just that distinguishing of like taking the idea of perfect out of what would have been I don't know, would that be the Greek mindset of perfect as this idea of like, a certain kind of quality that you have to achieve, and more about wholeness. Like, yeah, I thought that I kind of wanted to start there to hear you chat about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. My mind went to the same place about the Greek ideal, which you see in all of the marble statues that have been uncovered. And we carry that even outside the church, with all the filters that you can put on Instagram to blot out your facial blemishes. We were just with our neighbors the other day, and they were talking about how they're fighting against their wrinkles. That we have this idea that perfect is flawless, that it's this ideal state. And then we could really get into the weeds, because my mind goes to, like, who's the one who establishes the ideal state?
Mm-hmm.
And who says what is perfect? But I think when I read I actually, I don't know which reading it was in, but I had that highlighted what you just read. And, the Hebrew understanding was very different. It did carry this idea of wholeness. But wholeness, I think that, the mental furniture in our head has been set so firmly by Greek thought, really Western thought, that even wholeness, we're like, it's all put back together perfectly. But the Hebrew idea is much more, this is the thing that's suited for its purpose. So like, when it's not a one for one, but when God looks at creation and says it's good, it means that this is being used for its intended purpose. This is why it's here, and this is how it's going to be used. And that wholeness is not free from flaws, but you are someone who is set apart, you're sacred, you're going to be used. I think it's Carl Jung says holiness and wholeness come from the same root. And so this idea of being made whole is that you're set apart, you're being used for a purpose. And to open ourselves up, the question becomes like, what is that purpose that we're going to be used for?
Yeah, I like that a lot. The idea that like wholeness is being used for the purpose that you were intended for. So it's like after this book started shaping me for things, the language I started using a lot of was like who you were designed and created to be. The idea of like this pursuit of like, and maybe not even pursuit, I wonder if it was the wrong language, but like access to and openness to the who you were designed and created to be, what the purpose that you were made for, as wholeness. I think it's a helpful like reframing, I feel like, of that.
For sure. And I think too, there's that can feel elusive. Like, what am I here for? And, or what do I put on this earth to do? However you want to say it. And I think one of the things I'm learning currently is we almost like try to leave ourselves when we have that conversation. And so we're thinking more in like the bigger, broader universe. Like, what does God want from me? And it's almost like we're trying to get away from ourselves when we ask that question. But one of the phrases I return to over and over with our staff specifically is that God wastes nothing. And so, again, going back to the ideal state of perfection, I'm like, no, if this is about who we are created to be, there's who we were created to be, but then there's also all the things that we've experienced, and the belief, like that integration of how we've been wired and all that we've experienced, that if God wastes nothing, like no one has had the experiences I've had with the same wiring I've had. So in some ways I am like an exquisite and exotic cocktail of this nature and then these experiences, and how are those things put together? And I bring that up because I do think it's a lifelong pursuit and journey. And it also requires taking a good hard look at yourself and being honest about it, and not just expecting that there's like God's going to beam in some purpose from the heavens. But really that hard work of integration. And that's one of the things that struck me about this chapter and reading it again is like, yeah, this is heart level work. This is soul work. This requires a lot.
Yeah. Well, first, I have often described you as an exquisite and exotic cocktail. So I appreciate you bringing that back up.
I make good
You
cocktails.
do make exquisite, not always exotic, but exquisite cocktails. But yeah, it seems like some of what Willard is getting at in this chapter, and even within the context of like what the Sermon on the Mount is doing, is to say that there is this like true reality of the way things actually are. It's the flying the plane the right side up, and it's like undergirding, this is energy undergirding the universe, and that like when you tap into that you are finding like, oh, this is like the way things are supposed to be, the kind of life that, well, what he gets into in this chapter and unpacking some of the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the kind of life that does not hold contempt to another person, but actually sees them as a valuable image bearer of God. That this is the like real, the reality that's underneath the thing. Does that feel like some of what you're kind of getting at and some of what you heard within that?
Yeah, for sure. Because you're reframing everything. And so like even, going back to that perfection thing, well, why did he include the word whole? Like, why did Willard? Because he's trying to reframe it for us. And so don't frame it through the Greek idea of perfection. Frame it through a wholeness or a holiness or a sacredness. I mean, in the part where he speaks about anger and contempt and other people, I was reminded of the C.S. Lewis first sermon, later an essay, Weight of Glory, where he says, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. You've never met a mere mortal. And that's the kind of vision I think that Jesus was about. And it's so easy if you like unplug from that, you can easily objectify people, you can demonize people, you can do anything you want with human beings.
Yeah.
But if you're back into that place of wholeness and sacredness, and the Christ who is all and is in all, as Paul says, I think it's in Colossians, everyone all of a sudden carries a sacred quality about them. And let's be honest, in some people it's much more difficult to find, and I'm not trying to be funny. Like, there's some people where you wonder if that really is real,
Yes.
But that's the work. That I was referring to earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a helpful thing to get into, like maybe some of the bigger overall moves that he makes in this chapter, right? Where like he gets into the weeds a bit on anger and contempt, gets into the weeds a bit on lust, gets into the weeds a bit on divorce, but it feels like one of the overarching things within all of that. He pits like inner transformation against just creating new law, right? That it's
Mhm.
like, don't just not say these words, that it's about an inner transformation. And it felt to me like, I don't know if he directly says this, but one of the things that I heard as an undergirding thing is like getting to this point where you have this framework where you are viewing other people as sacred images, where you're viewing other people as significant, holy, as siblings, as uh, women and men, people who bear the full image of God, and that fundamentally then changes how you interact with them, what you want from them, what your expectations are of them, your thoughts about them, all those sorts of things. So I'm curious, to me, the question that like moves us like another step beyond that is like, how do we get to that framework? Because like you said, it's easier with some people. And even, gosh, I'm thinking a couple of things. One is, I think like when we get familiar with some people, we lose that. Like maybe with your spouse, your partner, you see something like that in them, and then you become familiar and you lose some of that. And maybe he even talks a little bit about like the contempt that can begin to build in a partner relationship. But then also that there's the folks that are just um, blatantly uh, uh, there are folks in the public eye and folks in our personal lives that are just so far off of the way that they're living and even the damage that they're doing that it becomes hard to see them in that way. So like, how do we cultivate the kind of personhood that sees people that way? Or how have you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, yeah, I think for me, it took me a long time to ever view myself that way.
Huh. To view yourself,
And what's
to
that?
view yourself that way.
Yeah, yeah, that I'm deeply loved. And I mean, I could go on and on as to some of the reasons that I've learned over the years, but there is some of what he's pointing to, and I would say trying to help us with the course correction is, and some of what people have picked up depending on how they grew up. If you grew up in the church, I mean, I look at like fundamentalism and some forms of evangelicalism. This is not the starting point, is that you're a beloved child of the Almighty.
Yeah.
The starting point is like you're a turd, which is a loose translation of the Greek, but there, but it's, I mean, I had a memory when I was at a Bible camp or a retreat or something when I was 14, and the speaker was saying, you know, when God looks at you, what he sees are maggots, and Jesus became a maggot for you. And like,
Uh,
that's an extreme form of
yep.
messaging to drop on 14-year-old kids. And, but what he was saying fundamentally, while it was like charged with really intense words, the message behind it's not abnormal. And so it's almost this idea of like God's tolerating you because God's really great. And in the words of Rohr, he says that leads to a cautious standoff with an angry deity, not a love story.
Mm.
And so for me, I remember sitting with a therapist probably 15 plus years ago, and he said, "You really have a lot of self-loathing." And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "Yes, you do." And I said, "No, I don't." And then I tried to be funny and like I kind of pointed at myself and I was like, "How could I hate this?" And he leaned forward and was like, "I'm not effing around," and really woke me up to, like, I had been trained to think that I was in fact just a maggot, that I wasn't worth much, and that I should be like just basically like thanking God all the time, like, I'm so happy you saved me, and like you'll tolerate me as long as I'm under the blood. And that's a far different story than a longing in the heart of God for me and for you and for everyone who's listening and for humanity as a whole. It's not just the individualistic side, but it's this longing and this love that is the essence of God. And it took me a long time to believe it. And I still remember the first time I was overwhelmed with, I would say the first time I believed, maybe, is kind of one of my many conversions. And I'm not kidding. I cried probably for 3 days on and off. Like I was overwhelmed with something struck me of like, no, you are loved. You are loved. I actually, when it first hit me, I called my wife because I wanted to tell somebody. And when she answered, I couldn't really talk. And she was like, hey, is everything okay? Is everything okay? And I was like, I'm loved. She was like, oh, I know, but I think that's a really important starting place because until we believe it about ourselves, like, I don't think we have the power to give it. I don't think we have the power to give it away. It's interesting to me. One of the, if you want to call it initiation stories about Jesus is his baptism. And in all of the Gospels, except for Luke, this is really kind of the first story we're met with about Jesus. And he hadn't like done any miracles. He hadn't won any arguments with the scribes and Pharisees. He hadn't healed anybody. And he goes into the waters of baptism. And the first thing he hears is, you are my beloved son. With you I'm well pleased. And I think that's a message we need to hear over and over and over before we can get into anything else, because now there's nothing to prove and no one to impress. So all of these rules that Willard points out that the scribes and Pharisees were so big on, like it's not that they don't matter, but all of a sudden you encounter them in a much different way.
Yeah. And it's so easy to default into those, it feels like, because it's like it's something tangible for us. It's tactile. It's to just simply be like, oh, I'm loved. Like that can feel, without a fuller embrace of it, it can feel thin or small or just abstract. Right?
Yeah.
And the concrete thing is, I didn't say, in the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't say raka, you fool. I didn't use contemptuous language towards you. Or I didn't act with lust towards that person. And I made sure I bounced my eyes and like made sure like every time I started to look at somebody else in this like desirous way, I bounced my eyes away from them. And I did this tangible thing. So I've got something concrete I can point to. And the other thing feels so intangible. And our program, my experience is that our programs in the life of the church, or the books that are being written, the things like that to help us deal with this stuff, almost always move us towards that concrete, creating new laws, new rules, new like activities of the way of doing the thing that don't actually fix the thing.
Yeah.
So like I was thinking about he brings up in the discussion around lust, he says like there's movements of like guys that get together and do the like, we're gonna avoid looking at women in this way. And like in my early 20s, like I had friends that we would get together and we read, I don't even remember what the book was, super popular book at the time, where we were like, we're gonna bounce our eyes and we're gonna hold each other accountable to bouncing our eyes. And the folks in that group, I can't tell you how many of them have actually had affairs and continuing to some of them to have affairs. And like it didn't actually fix the problem, right? That it was like so anyways, all that to say, and then one more thing, and then I'll let you kind of riff for a bit, is one of the discoveries for me is super helpful is that Christian ethics is always an ethics of yes instead of an ethics of no. So it's not about what you're avoiding, it's about what you're moving towards. And as you move towards the right things, it causes you to avoid those other things. And so some of what I'm hearing you say is that there is this movement towards the saying yes to your belovedness and owning that has these sort of like ripple effects on the things that you are doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think about it. Like, if you ever been around a little kid who's really fully secure in the fact that their parents love them, they're some of the most pleasant children to be around in the world, compared to kids who are either, like the kids who, if you've ever been around, usually this can happen like 7 or 8. And I'm not blaming parents for this, but the kids who, want to just tell you about how you're breaking all the rules all the time, and they're really annoying. I mean, but kids who have a sense of being deeply loved, there's a innocence around them. There's a wonder around them. They'll go up to anybody and make that person feel wonderful. And I'm like, what is it about a child that's loved that is, in this weird way has like a gravitas where people are drawn toward them. I'm thinking of a couple in our church. Their kid just a couple weeks ago was up on the platform after a Sunday and was like preaching and like waving his arms around. My wife sent me a video of it and said, "We found your replacement." But everyone I know that knows this little guy, I mean, you bring up Jackson's name and people are like, "Oh, Jackson, that kid." And he's 3. I also know his parents, who are some of the most joy-filled, fun-loving, wildly inclusive human beings I've ever met in my life. And I'm like, well, that's exactly what we're talking about. And somehow we learn along the way that we have to prove and we have to impress. And I think that's just some of the normal growth patterns of being a human being. But to be freed from that, I'm not compelled to obey the rules. I don't have to obey the rules. And what I took a lot from, this chapter is you almost get into a place where it's not like, well, I'm going to make sure that I don't say this about that person. It's much more in a place of saying, like, I would, like, if you said to someone who's really deeply has a sense of being loved and loves others, would you call that person a fool? Like, that thought doesn't even cross their mind.
Yeah. Yep.
Because the love, I think that it's not just that the love of God is in me, but how do I begin to open up where it flows through me? So it's in me and through me. And so what other people are experiencing is, in fact, the love of God through me, the grace of God through me. And that, for me, that really changes things. And I think it's the idea of, like you were saying, the concrete, that's a hard habit to break. Like, it's a really addictive drug because it gives you a sense of security and purpose, and it can feed the self-righteous monster, which I don't know anybody who's above self-righteousness, including me. And one of the notes that I made when I was reading it last few days was on page 143, where it talks about how the fundamental mistake of the scribes and Pharisees is they focus on the actions that the law requires and make elaborate specifications of exactly what those actions are and of the manner in which they are to be done. And this is one of the things, I talk about this on one of the retreats I lead, that I think a lot of what I've seen happening in this movement away from evangelicalism toward a more inclusive or progressive or post-evangelical expression of faith is we just have a whole new set of actions that we now require. Mm-hmm. And we have very exact specifications of exactly what those actions are in the manner in which they are to be done. And so you think about language, language we will not use and language you have to use, and postures you have to take. And for me, it's the whole idea of like the contents and container of, if I have a bowl filled with popcorn, I can dump the popcorn out and fill it with cookies. But the way I'm holding, like the contents have changed, but the way I'm holding it isn't. And I think the only way you can begin exchanging the container is if you actually say, this bowl was great for popcorn, but we're not eating it at that anymore. And we're also not going to use this bowl anymore because it's not helpful and it's not healthy. And I think that shifting of the containers is that shifting toward what Jesus says, love God, love others, which is, how do you measure that? Like, how could I say to you, I love God more than you do? Like, that's an asinine statement, and no one would get that. Or I love others more than you. Like, and so it feels good to have something concrete to hold on to. But I think that what we've seen over thousands of years, even in Jesus' days, the results of that are not producing really good things. And back to Jackson, I'm like, there's so much freedom in being a young, innocent. I mean, I think maybe this is what Jesus meant when he said becoming a child. I don't know many people in their mid-20s who would walk up on a church platform after a service is over and start waving their arms around and preaching because they just want to do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I think that's some of what he's getting at here, which I really, really resonate with for sure.
Yeah. I appreciate that language of like the container. because I was also thinking about you specifically, and just because we've had these conversations around the keeping the same container. I haven't heard you use that language, but the idea of like we have shifted from we watch people shift from a conservative faith to a progressive faith, but they're just as much of a fundamentalist as they were before.
Yeah.
Just about different things. And he gets into that, yeah, like you pointed it out there. I kind of felt like he taps that a little bit when he's talking about anger and talks about like this. He actually, I'm going to look up the quote that I wrote down because I looked up who he was referencing and it was Cornell West, which like honestly like messed with me a little bit. But he says a leading social commentator, and he gives a footnote there. It's on page 151. A leading social commentator, and it's Cornell West, now teaches that despair and rage are an essential element in the struggle for justice. He and others who teach this are sowing the wind and will reap the whirlwind, the tornado. Indeed, we're reaping it now in a nation increasingly sick with rage and resentment of citizen towards citizen, and often the rage and resentment is upheld and justified in the name of God. And gosh, I read that and was like, this was, I keep forgetting when, I think it was 96, 99 when the book was written. Um, this was written like how many decades
Nine,
ago? And then now 98 is, yeah,
98. Yep.
98. So it's written in
You can
98.
hear my pages turning.
And it feels
It's
like,
actually not. It's actually not the book. It's another book. But I just want to sound like I have the book in
get
front of
the
me.
get the flipping pages on the mic there. But it feels like, gosh, he could be writing this today in our public
Hmm.
discourse, in the Christian discourse, in the public square, on like a resentment of citizen towards citizen, and the rage and resentment is upheld and justified in the name of God. And we could. I'm definitely not a both side-ism guy on so many things, but gosh, it is hard not to see this happening on both sides.
Oh, it's 100% hard. I think there's been a regression on both sides. You have you and I have talked over the years about spiral dynamics, and I don't know if that's something you've covered, but it's a theory of human development. And thinking of who is it, Teilhard de Chardin, who says, any ecosystem, you're not going to have any kind of new growth until there's some disequilibrium in the environment. And we've had a lot of disequilibrium, I think, I mean, I don't think it's one person or one thing, but a ton of disequilibrium starting really in the 90s when you think about the advent of the internet and email and everything else and the information age. But one of the things spiral dynamics would say is that when there's that disequilibrium, like when we begin evolving, there's a necessary regression before there's a progress.
Hmm.
And so if you look at when people say like, how can white evangelicals rally around Trump? Like, well, they've regressed to the stage before them, which is the stage of power and the stage of anger and then you look at people who are in this postmodern, speak your truth, who, when Donald Trump was elected, all of a sudden they really cared about the facts. Where all truth, there's no absolute truth. All of a sudden, the New York Times is saying the truth is now more important than ever. Most recently, a newscaster with Rachel Maddow said, we're going to fact check the hell out of one of Trump's speeches. And that's a regression. Like, we're all taking a step back. And so that idea, we only take a step back in this, by the way, my wife and dog just walked in the door, so that's the background noise. But you have this regression, this movement backward as humans, when you have fear. So you're going to go toward what you know, because that's easier than going someplace you've never been. And I think a lot of the rage and the anger does come out of fear. Like, anger oftentimes is hurt and fear coming out. And I would say, like, for Cornell West, I mean, why I didn't know it was him until you just said that. But I do think he's right to say, like, despair and rage have a place, and you see that all over the Psalms, in the imprecatory Psalms and the Psalms of Lament. I think what's happened is in what he's pointing out in the quote you just read is what we've done is we've misplaced the anger and we've misplaced the despair. And so now we fear the other, whoever that other is. So our anger directed at them feels justified and feels right because they are the ones doing this. The despair, the sadness, the cynicism, as he talks about the contempt. I think it's deeply misplaced is what's happened. And so in the embrace of it, we haven't given people an education around what to do with it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to try to put together a few things that I'm hearing here that I think for me feel really significant. So you're talking about this kid who's growing up in security and is able to be fully himself. Is able to live the language we were using earlier of whole in some ways. Then we've got this idea of that we are shifting we're shifting contents, but keeping the containers the same. And so we're not actually growing, and we're not actually moving towards this goodness of heart that Jesus describes here. And a part of it seems to be because like we have these like we need something tangible to grab a hold of. And so when we think about the idea of growing up in security, that's not most people's reality, or at some point there becomes some sort of shifting and breaking where you're not living in that wholeness anymore. And Willard would say, like, the universe is a perfectly safe place to be. God is the most joyous being. And so in some ways, to come to a recognition of God in the way that Willard understands God should like help move us towards that security. But the reality is that that's still abstract. That God is still abstract, and the concrete things I'm experiencing are different than that. And so how do we, with all of that, like what are the things that we do that help us to move towards that security, that it's not just an ethereal, abstract idea, that it actually helps us to move towards the right kind of heart, that it doesn't just default into different actions, but is actually developing like an internal transformation?
That was an easy question. This is the introvert side of me that's deflecting so I can think for a second.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, a part of why I'm asking you is because I think, number one, you are one of the people who I really respect, who I have seen lead people through this kind of work. I've seen that you've done deep thought on this, and you do your own work in this area significantly and extensively. So like, I don't want to miss hearing like your wisdom lived, like, because you have lived experience and taught experience around this.
Yeah. It struck me when you were talking about the concrete, that feels good and gives us security. And one of the things I think that we shouldn't miss is like God didn't choose to remain this mystery. I mean, God is a mystery, but that's the wrong word. God didn't choose to remain the spiritual orb somewhere off in the heavens. But as John says, he put on skin and bone and dwelled among us. And if you go with the Franciscan side of things, they would say that all of creation is an expression of the Christ. And so a couple of things that came to mind. One, I live in Colorado, so, it avails itself to, well, I should say, not the mountains for me anyway. But there is something about like when people say, yeah, I really experience God in nature. Like it can feel like a soundbite, but I fully 100% understand what they're talking about. And how do we move through this world with great intention to see God in all things? Not that, it's an important distinction. This is not saying the tree in my front yard is God, but that God is in the tree, that the life of God, the breath of God, the thing that holds all things together, as Paul says, those to experience that and experience it kind of in an eyes wide open part, I think is really important. And I think that can teach us something. And it's taught me a lot over the years, I've done a lot of things in the outdoors, whether it's different programs or time alone in the wilderness. I think the other piece is the concrete expression of the body of Christ. Like, this is not, I think we'd be remiss not to say, like, we're not talking about individual lives, but we're talking about life on life. And one of the best things that ever happened to me was when we moved to Denver, my wife and I invited a bunch of families, like, let's all live in the same neighborhood, send our kids to the same school. And we ended up living right next door to one family. We had another couple who lived with us for the first 8 months until they could find a spot. And the way I described it is, like, when you have friends over that they're friends, but you're not incredibly close, you know when they're coming, you clean up the house. And when they walk in, they'll always be like, oh, the house looks great. And you're like, oh, it was a mess 20 minutes ago. Ha ha ha. And what you've really done is just packed all the crap away in the closet. What I learned living in community was your front door was always open and people would walk in and see the mess. And the mess of your life, the mess of, that you were making as a parent or as a spouse. And to be met in those moments with love versus rules. There was something very concrete in my friend Dugan and his wife Jess, and in my friend Lacey and her husband John. There was that I experienced Christ in them. And not that it was like, if I was being a total jerk where they'd be like, oh, it's okay, rules don't matter. It wasn't rules at that point. It was that they had a love in them and through them that was directed toward me, that brought me to a place of being able to see myself without all the attending shame and guilt and beating myself up. And I think when we can develop those kind of communities, which is a huge risk. I could tell you about the pain that came out of that experiment and the disappointment. But all of that belongs because you can learn something through it all. And so I don't think that it's in some ways, like, what we're abandoning is the concreteness of rules, and we're trading it up for the concreteness of this good world in which we live and the people that we're doing this life alongside. And I can say I have learned more by seeing and experiencing God in this world than probably any other vehicle. Because I can be pretty cerebral and I can just read, a lot and think about a lot in my head. But when I'm able to get out of that, and it's that, I still think God puts on skin and bone. And I think this is what Paul was talking about, the body of Christ. I think who was at the early church mother and fathers used to say, God became human so human can become gods. It's that theosis idea that we can be by grace what Jesus is by nature, that we can experience that kind of union with God. And I think that kind of depth, in some ways, like I said, it's concrete, but it's still that mystery. It's still like, what do you mean union with God? What does that look like? But I can tell you this, I walked into rooms before where there have been people sitting, well, I'll name drop, if that's okay.
Name drop all you want.
I experienced this when I walked into a room the first time I met Richard Rohr. I didn't see him. I sensed like there's something going on in this room. And it wasn't like it wasn't like I walked into a room and saw, Bono or like Beyonce or something. You're just like starstruck. There was like a sense in the room. And when I introduced myself and we talked for a bit, I was like, there is something so deep that's brewing in this fella. Almost like it's the people you meet and you're like, I think I could tell you my worst secret and everything would be okay. In fact, it would probably be better. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I don't believe that's reserved just for the Richard Rohrs of the world. I think this is what we experience when we're drawn towards someone and can't explain it. And it's not that they have fame or wealth or status, but they have a love and an embrace and an acceptance. And they're not going to let you off the hook, but it's not because you've broken the rules. It's because they believe you are worth far more than whatever you're messing around with.
Dude, that's so good. And that's so like, Like, friends, this is why I don't want to just like pick apart the chapter, because like the chapter leads us into these other places, into these other things that like we would miss otherwise. And yeah, that I have experienced, well, both at like stayed at your house and experienced what you're describing of the kind of community that you've created, which in some ways like reminded me of what I loved about dorm living in college, of that kind of in and out experience of people that just like some of those uh borders kind of fade away a little bit,
Yeah.
but it's like this more mature version of it as you describe it, of like showing up in a more mature kind of way where it becomes more robust, in this concreteness of who is it that said the Christ in me sees the Christ in you, like the um
Oh yeah.
th-
I can't recall.
but that's some of what I'm hearing you describe in this, is that it's like the abstractness of God becomes concrete in God putting on flesh. And it's not just that God at one time put on flesh. God keeps becoming concrete. God keeps putting on flesh. And we keep
Yeah.
experiencing God in that kind of way if we will allow ourselves to have the eyes to see it and the intentionality to open ourselves up to it.
Yeah, and that's the risk, is like you're going to get hurt. When you if you open yourself up, you're going to get hurt. I think I'm reminded of, is it Genesis 6 where it says in God, yeah, it's Genesis 6 where it says something like, God saw that every inclination of the human heart was only evil all the time. And some people love that verse because it's just proof, that they're like, oh, you're terrible. But what comes right after that is I think like a real literal translation of the Hebrew is, and God was troubled in his heart, he was troubled. And, Hebrew is a pretty like limited language. They have like 9,000 words compared to our 50,000. So when they double down on a word, it's like us saying very, very, very troubled. And there was a rabbi, there's a fellow named Alan, one time he was talking about it, and he was like, what kind of deity allows himself to be moved by the actions of mere mortals? And I was really struck by that. And I was like, wow, God's wild, expansive love is the very thing that allows God to be troubled and wounded and saddened. Like, that's a very different picture than this God who's just pissed off because people aren't doing all the rules, right? And so one of the things I've learned is that, like, if you're going to participate in that love, you're going to feel that pain too, So like, I'm saying this because it's not all rosy. It's not like we're sitting around night after night with a guitar and singing together.
That was my college dorm
It's
experience,
life.
though, by the way. That's what happens when you go to a Christian
well, you
college.
said more mature,
Yeah.
so we're barely more mature. Trust me. I mean, there's lots of farts and jokes and everything else with the well, sometimes with the kids, sometimes without them. But there is something about that that it's a risk, and I think it's only you're going to get out of it what you put into it. But when I talk about like those experiences, I remember there was a staff member. This was not long after I started working at Denver Community Church, who came and confessed that he had an affair, and said, "I want to sit with the board and tell them." And I was like, "Oh crap!" I mean, I'd worked in churches before this. I know how this goes. And he shared his like whole life story that was just brutal. I mean, abuse and all sorts of things. He didn't say it as an excuse, but just kind of helped us understand his state of mind. And when he was done, I looked around the table and almost every elder had tears in their eyes. They said, like, you need to bring your spouse in here, like, as soon as possible. We want to know how they're doing. And so the next time the spouse was there, and the care and love that they showed and the heartbreak. And when the spouse left, I said, guys, this has been amazing. Like, I didn't expect this. And our board chair said, well, like, this is grace. It's what we do. And it was almost like he was confused that I was surprised. Yeah. And like, those are the moments where you're like, this is beyond rules. And again, it's not saying, oh, it was okay that this person went. No, no one said that. But to be met with that kind of grace and love, that is going to change someone's life far more than being penalized because you broke
Yeah,
the
yeah,
rules.
yeah. Yeah. Well, and so it reminds me of like Willard writes, he says, all is changed when we realize that these are illustrations of what a certain kind of person, the kingdom person, will characteristically do in such situations. They are not laws, they're illustrations. And like that was when I first read this, that was such a change point for me in the way that I read the sermon, and like could open me up to like thinking about the way that you are talking about it here. Like the examples that you're giving, it's not a new law that like when somebody confesses this is what we now do, that we now have a new rule book of like, here's what we do here. It's that you just gave us an illustration. Jesus gave us illustrations, these pictures of this is what it looks like when you are becoming a kind of person. And so it's about the pursuit of becoming that kind of person more than it is about pursuit of doing those specific examples that he lays out or that you laid out here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Jesus is the blueprint. I mean, the thing that's kept me. Yeah. I mean, I've really had and still do, I kind of have like a complicated relationship with the church and with religion. But I really can say like I've had a pretty long love affair with Jesus. And it's tempting to be like, be perfect as God is perfect or whatever. That, oh, we have to do all the things Jesus did. And I'm like, no, I think we need to see the world and experience God in the way Jesus did. And then we'll be like him. And that's the harder road.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, before we wrap up, was there anything that we didn't talk about here that you wanted to make sure that we got to talk about? Because, you spent a lot of time reading the however long the chapter is, and I don't want to miss anything that you wanted to get into.
No, I was waiting for you to see what you wanted to talk to. I will say, when you mentioned that book, I think it was the one by Stephen Arterburn, that book about lust and bouncing the eyes.
Yes.
Yeah. Here's what's interesting about that is it still objectifies the other.
100%. Yes. It's not, yeah.
Yeah. That was the one thing when you said, I was like, yeah, because it's an object now that you just can't behold. I'm like, it's still an object. But yeah, if, I remember that book. I can't remember the name of it either, but I think that was the author's name.
Every Man's Battle.
But it was like, there it is. Yes. Oh, man. What's funny is every time we're together, you reference some of these old books, and it just makes me laugh. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. Yes. Because it was like probably 99, 2000, 2001, somewhere in there.
Yeah, probably. And I'll tell you what, like now that I know so much more about so many things in this world, like I'm sure that guy became a millionaire off of that industry, I'm sure.
Yeah, he probably did. But it doesn't. I mean, I always think back to my college days, and I mean that was very similar, and it didn't help.
No,
because it didn't transform. Like, how do you? Like, how again? You go back to that sacred piece. And yeah, all of a sudden, like you're beholding. It's the holiest object presented to your senses, and that's where I think the heart change really, really begins to come. And maybe that's even like an encouragement for all of us to think about is like, how much effort am I putting into trusting that I'm actually loved versus obeying all the rules? Because I think even if we say, well, like, screw all the rules, I'm done, I'm out of here, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, what I've learned is we're always going to subscribe to something. Like, there's always, even if someone's like, I'm an atheist, I'm like, okay, well, that is the story. And a respectable one, but you're still subscribing to something and you're living according to something outside yourself. And I think so many systems quickly devolve into this, do this, don't do that. And I think the freedom that's found in love, and that's a terrifying enterprise. I think love is more terrifying for us than having the real easy boundaries that we can measure ourselves by. But to have to trust in something bigger that you can't control it's pretty terrifying.
Dude, that's so good. Well, I want to make sure we point people to where they can find you, because you also like, actually, would you tell folks about like the retreats that you do, like what those kind of look like?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I have one coming up. Let me think here. April 26th, 28th. I don't know how many spots are left. Not many.
I think that'll be
So that
like
one's
just
called the Blue.
before. I think this comes out right after that.
Oh, okay.
So-
So I just did one.
Yeah. And it was awesome. Life
Um,
changing.
But yeah, I do. Like I did this for Church on Morgan out there in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I've traveled and done them 4 places. But really, it gets at what we were talking about earlier of how do we sketch a faith, kind of make plans for a faith that's worth building, moving forward, and begin asking questions about what do we need to bring forward. How do we get out of that cerebral mindset and begin moving toward not giving you more information that you'll have to unlearn and go to another retreat for in 15 years, but how do I curate and craft an experience and help you think through it?
Yeah.
And it's really for people who are in a place where we can use the word, they deconstructed a lot and they're like, I still think there's something here worth building. So yeah, I really enjoy doing those. I do a lot of work with people around how to live day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, building sustainable and healthy rhythms. But yeah, so if you want to look me up, it's just michael-hidalgo.com. michaelhidalgo.com for a lot of years was a lingerie photographer. I found out. And the way I found that out is I was speaking at a church and they put the wrong website up. And one of the pastors called me and said, "Can we get your correct website?" A lot of people are checking out this other site. But now michaelhidalgo.com is available. Apparently, I got an email. I can get it for, I think it was like $5,000.
Oh.
So I'm just going to stick with michael-hidalgo.com.
Michael-Hidalgo. We put it up in the show notes,
Yeah.
friends. So it'll be there for you. Hopefully correct. Well,
Yeah.
man, thanks for taking time today. Like, genuinely such a gift. This was so rich, so helpful. I took so much from it. So I really appreciate you
Awesome.
not only giving us the gift of your time and presence right now, but even like taking the time to plow through that chapter. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for the invite, dude. I'm always grateful that I can call you a friend.